I was at a high-end jazz club last Tuesday, observing a couple at the corner table. They were the picture of perfect synchronization, whispering about the technical precision of the bassist, sharing a single plate of expensive appetizers with practiced grace, and laughing at the exact same rhythmic cues. To any outsider, they looked like a couple celebrating a decade of marriage, or at the very least, a deep soul-level friendship. They had this effortless shorthand that suggested years of shared history. But then the set ended. Without a word of "we should do this again," or even a lingering glance, the man stood up, tapped a confirmation on his smartwatch, and walked toward the exit. The woman didn't even look up. She was already scrolling through a different interface. I struck up a conversation with her as she waited for her car. I mentioned how rare it is to see two people so in sync. She gave me a look that was both amused and slightly pitying. "Oh, we're not friends," she said, her voice entirely flat. "He's just my jazz interface. He has a 4.9 rating for music theory, and he never talks over the solos. Once the music stops, the contract is fulfilled. Why would I want to know his last name?" That moment of total clinical detachment, the transition from intimate synchronization to absolute strangers in a heartbeat, was jarring. It wasn't a fight, and it wasn't a breakup. It was something much more efficient and, frankly, much colder. She wasn't looking for a person. She was invoking a human API to satisfy a specific nutritional and aesthetic need. What was truly unsettling was her reaction when I asked if she ever felt lonely. Her expression didn't soften. It hardened into a defensive, almost superior posture. She told me that comprehensive relationships were a bad investment in high-risk assets that people in 2026 simply couldn't afford anymore. To her, the idea of a traditional friend, someone who might actually need something from her tomorrow, wasn't a comfort. It was a systemic threat. It made me wonder, have we actually become more sophisticated, optimizing our human contact for peak efficiency, or are we just the human version of Calhoun's beautiful ones, grooming ourselves in a perfect atomized cage while our ability to truly connect simply withers away? That story really stuck with me. We were watching this widespread, profound, yet subtle shift, the transition from relying on comprehensive, identity-based social contracts to operating through scene-specific, purely functional human interfaces. It feels like optimization has become a survival strategy. We are trying to minimize risk by reducing human contact to the transactional minimum.
And that framework, that idea of a risk-adjusted return on investment applied to human interaction, is precisely what we are deep diving into today. Our mission is to explore the underlying mechanics, the socioeconomic implications, the biological pressures, and of course the algorithmic incentives that are pushing this transition. We want to understand why adopting that functional interface model, that clinical detachment, is becoming a rational, even a necessary strategy for individuals navigating what you could call high social inflation and the attention oligopoly of the digital age. This analysis, it connects this hyper-optimized behavior we see online, particularly in things like dating and content creation, directly to these broader, much older theories of social breakdown and withdrawal.
Okay, let's unpack this shift first in the realm where vulnerability is traditionally highest, which is intimacy. It's hard to imagine a more comprehensive relationship than romance, yet it seems to be the place where this interface model is most deeply ingrained. We have to start with the core market dynamics of romance, particularly how the rise of digital dating reflects a huge, nearly invisible cultural change.
It's fundamental. Historically, love and marriage were highly structured. Yet social institutions, tradition, family, class, all these things dictated the rules of the game. But post-modernity, it sort of deregulated love. It ripped it out of those structures and left it entirely to the individual's free choice. And this is the starting point for understanding the modern misery of dating, according to sociologists like Eva Ilaus.
Wait, if we have freedom of choice, shouldn't that lead to happiness? We are free to choose anyone, unburdened by old rules. That sounds good.
That's the ideological promise, yes. But Ilaus argues the exact opposite is true. This burden of free choice is actually a massive source of suffering for the individual. Well, if you have infinite choice, you are burdened with the responsibility of picking the best possible partner, the optimal asset. And if the endeavor fails, well, you have only yourself to blame because you made the choice. This creates a deeply contradictory combination. You're supposed to follow economic logic, find the best asset, while at the same time following emotional logic, following your heart. And you're doing this in a field that is inherently uncertain and deeply, deeply competitive.
I see the dilemma. The pressure to optimize, which is the cornerstone of economic thinking, it just crashes headfirst into the messy reality of human connection. And this is precisely where dating apps step in. They position themselves as the ultimate technologies of choice, promising a way out of that existential burden.
Precisely. They promise a rationalization of intimacy. They claim to subdue the mystery and risk of romance and boil it down to scientific selection using data, using algorithms. They offer a perceived rescue from the burden of free choice by promising efficiency and control, presenting romantic exchange as a kind of commodified, manageable game. They're essentially saying, stop guessing, start optimizing.
But this optimism, this idea of a rational, efficient market for love, that gets challenged pretty hard by the actual experience of users, doesn't it? If the market is so rational, why is dating so exhausting for so many people?
Because the market metaphor only works if the participants are rational actors with transparent, stable exchange values. But our sources reveal that dating app marketization is fundamentally entrepreneurial. It's just rife with structural uncertainty. Users are perpetually negotiating risk because they are interacting with quasi-strangers, people who have presented a highly curated version of themselves that lacks historical context or any guaranteed veracity.
So the commodity being exchanged isn't objective value like, I don't know, a house or a stock. It's the self, but the self conceived of as a brand or an asset. Your profile isn't the authentic you. It's a public version, a curated performance, a promise.
A promise that can only be fulfilled with the active, costly contribution of another person's time and vulnerability.
Right.
Exactly. And because the sign value of these profiles is inherently uncertain and it fluctuates based on all these external factors like your last swipe, the general mood of the platform, the latest social trends trust becomes extraordinarily difficult to build. You are trading on the promise of the future. Therefore, instead of using metaphors of choosing and knowing, dating app culture is much better described by metaphors of betting and guessing. You are constantly investing in opaque signs of intangible values, just hoping for a return on your psychological and emotional investment.
That structural uncertainty and the pressure to perform brings us to the strategic self, where that old advice of just be yourself is rendered completely, utterly obsolete. And to illustrate just how brutally unfair this market is, we have to talk about the Tinder Gini coefficient. For listeners who may not be economists, could you remind us what the Gini coefficient measures?
Sure. The Gini coefficient is the standard economic measure for wealth or income inequality in a population. A score of 0 means perfect equality. Everyone has the same amount of wealth. A score of 1 means perfect inequality. One person has absolute everything. It's a crucial indicator of social stability.
Okay, so with that in mind, the analysis of the Tinder economy shows it has a Gini coefficient of 0.58. I want to just pause on that number for a moment, 0.58. That level of inequality is staggering.
It truly is. To put that number in perspective for you, the income disparity in the United States, which is often criticized as being extreme, hovers around 0.48. So this is significantly worse.
So worse than one of the most unequal developed nations on Earth.
And not just that, a Gini coefficient of 0.58 is comparable to economies on the verge of civil collapse, where social contracts are literally breaking down under the weight of resource hoarding by an elite few.
That comparison is terrifying. We are importing inequality levels typically seen in failed states into the most intimate parts of our lives. How does that brutal 0.58 translate into romantic availability? What does it look like on the ground?
The translation is that the top 15% of men capture 80% of female attention, and that's defined as receiving likes, messages, and matches. This is not a balanced market. It's a winner-take-all environment optimized for the hyper-elite.
Which means the remaining 85% of men, the vast majority, are essentially fighting for scraps, or, as our sources put it, crumbs. The average user is fundamentally invisible. So when people are advised, just be yourself, they're essentially being set up for failure because being natural statistically places them squarely in that 85%.
It creates a tremendous strategic barrier. To pass it, you don't just need to be better looking, better income, whatever. You need to be strategically different. You have to utilize techniques that break through the noise of this structurally unequal attention market.
But I have to ask, is this extreme inequality just a feature of dating apps, or is it reflecting something deeper, something biological that the digital environment has just amplified?
Oh, it's absolutely the latter. We have to look at the deep biological pressures rooted in Robert Travers' parental investment theory, which he developed back in the early 1970s. This helps explain the extreme selectivity, or what we're calling digital hypergamy, the tendency to seek partners of equal or more often greater status.
Explain the core logic of Trivers' theory in this context for us.
The theory revolves around the cost of reproduction. If you jump back 50,000 years to the ancestral environment, a choice error for a man might cost 5 minutes of lost pleasure. There's virtually no serious consequence, as his investment is minimal. But for a woman, a choice error meant 9 months of obligatory pregnancy, a very risky childbirth, and the real possibility of raising a child alone if the male was incompetent, non-committal, or just vanished. The consequence of a bad choice was potentially life-threatening to both her and her offspring.
So the evolutionary pressure on females was to be profoundly, fundamentally cautious. They are the resource that is being sought, and their mechanism for managing that risk is extreme selectivity.
Exactly. Women are biologically cautious because the price of a mistake is astronomically higher. The digital market, by removing all the traditional social filters like having mutual friends or knowing someone through a shared community and increasing the pool of choices exponentially, it simply amplifies that cautious selection process to a brutal extreme.
So the female user is now faced with a virtually infinite pool of quasi-strangers, meaning her screening filters have to become ruthlessly efficient.
And that explains the Gini coefficient.
That makes perfect sense. The strategic response to this saturated market, then, has to be the pattern interrupt. Since being polite, natural, and friendly behaviors that used to facilitate trust now just mark you as safe. And in a flood of attention, harmless means useless.
If you are one of the 85%, you cannot afford to be safe. You have to be polarizing. This is why we see techniques from neurolinguistic programming, NLP, and aggressive copywriting entering the dating sphere. The goal is no longer relationship building. It's manufacturing engagement. You have to instantly create polarity and engagement by triggering what's called the Zeigarnik effect.
The Zeigarnik effect, that's the brain's psychological need to close an open loop, right?
That's the one. The brain hates unresolved tension.
Let's focus on the concrete illustration from the research. The difference between a polite opener and what was dramatically termed Thomas's revenge.
The data is stark. The unsuccessful polite opener, that generic, low-risk, low-information, hey, how was your weekend, has a near zero return on investment because it's easily predicted and just as easily ignored. But Thomas, having learned the lesson of invisibility, used a pattern interrupt opener, something like, I hesitated.
That's a powerful two-word grenade thrown into a polite digital conversation. I hesitated.
It is. And the analysis of its success is fascinating because it works on multiple psychological levels. First, there's no hello, which immediately skips the soft, polite pleasantries and demands attention.
It's direct.
Very. Second, I hesitated is a subtle disqualification. It instantly implies the sender is selective, not desperate, which immediately increases his perceived value. He's not just automatically conquered by your profile. And third, and this is the most important part, the mystery triggers the Zeigarnik effect. Why did he hesitate? The receiver's brain needs to know the reason to close that open loop, and that forces a reply.
So the conversation starts not with a shared interest, but with a paradigmatic shift. The successful trial showed the woman replied, often nervously, asking a question, seeking validation or at least an explanation.
Precisely. That single strategically deployed opener bypasses the screening mechanism. It perfectly encapsulates the shift to transactional high-strategy intimacy. It's no longer about establishing mutuality. It's about manufacturing engagement through psychological leverage, treating the other person's attention as a resource to be hijacked.
That makes me wonder about the psychological cost of this high-strategy existence. If every interaction has to be a pattern interrupt just to achieve basic recognition, what happens to genuine vulnerability? Are we essentially training ourselves to become that jazz interface partner, perfectly functional, totally clinical, and ultimately disposable?
That is the core risk of this functional approach. This manufacturing of engagement leads directly to a distinct form of what you could call functional trust. We are not talking about deep social bonds built on reciprocity and shared identity. We are talking about trust in the sense developed by the sociologist Niklas Luhmann as a way of simplifying complexity in a dangerous world.
Could you unpack that Luhmannian notion for us? What does functional trust look like in this kind of environment?
So Luhmann conceptualized trust not as an emotional state, but as a mechanism for reducing complexity and uncertainty. When you trust, what you're really doing is accepting risk. In the dating app context, interpersonal trust is built entirely on the assessment of the risk of interacting with non-intimate quasi-strangers. You are only seeking enough of a signal to determine that the person is not going to waste your time or, hurt you.
The interaction then is almost procedural. Communication without communication, as you mentioned earlier. The initial match or swipe right isn't really an appreciation of the person.
Not at all. It's an appreciation of the profile's brand. Or, more accurately, it's a request for more signals to reduce that structural uncertainty.
That's why the friction is so incredibly high. The profile is the promise. The first few messages are the due diligence.
And we have anecdotal evidence that confirms the immense cost of this labor. One user reported having only one actual embodied date for every 60 to 100 matches.
60 to 100.
Yes. Think about the amount of time, screening, and hermeneutic labor. I mean, the sheer effort spent trying to interpret opaque signs and intentions required just to move from a digital sign to a vaguely prospective coffee meeting.
The cost of getting off the bench and into the game is immense. The entire market is optimized for screening out perceived high-risk assets, not for cultivating deep connection. This just reinforces the idea that people are becoming interchangeable functional interfaces. They are the Jazz interface 4.9 ratings for a specific skill, but lacking the messy, unpredictable context that makes a person a friend or a partner.
Now, let's zoom out from that highly specific, high-stakes intimacy market to the broader digital ecosystem that drives behavior. The attention oligopoly. The competition we just discussed in dating is replicated perfectly in content creation.
And the link between the two, which is crucial for you to grasp, is the limited resource. In dating, it's attention and time. In the broader digital world, attention is the currency. Content creation is a high-stakes competition strategically influenced by algorithms that determine who gets rich and who remains invisible.
This is where we can turn to game theory to help us formally model these incentives, specifically using the Stackelberg model. We need to use this model because it captures hierarchical strategic interactions, which perfectly describes the creator-platform relationship.
And the hierarchy is simple. The platform, via its code, is the decision maker that moves first, and the creators are the reactive players.
Correct. The algorithm is the leader. It dictates the terms by setting the exposure and reward rules, assigning specific quantitative weights, which we can call alpha, beta, gamma for clicks, watch time, and shares to different metrics. The creators are the followers. They observe how the algorithm incentivizes behavior and then choose strategies designed to maximize their own payoff, their utility.
Viewer preferences and sponsor pressures, then, are external forces that the model has to incorporate.
Exactly.
Okay, let's define the two primary content strategies creators face based on what consistently garners engagement. You have the low-risk approach. Collaboration, which generally yields high watch time, will assign this a value of 5 for our model, but has 0 drama risk, value of 0. It's stable, long-term, and brand safe.
And then you have the high-stakes strategy. Beefing, engaging in public, sensational conflict. This yields high clicks, let's say 5, and high shares, a 4, because conflict is inherently shareable and click-worthy. But it carries a significant drama risk, which we'll value at 3.
So the creator's goal is to maximize their perceived value or utility based on those weights the algorithm sets. The utility function calculates this payoff. Creators is a combination of rewards, clicks, watch time, shares, minus a penalty for drama risks.
And the critical variable here is delta, the sponsor sensitivity coefficient. It measures how harshly sponsors punish controversial content because that's money walking out the door for a creator.
So if the algorithm is the leader, then its priorities, the weights it assigns, directly determine the creator equilibrium. We can predict whether the digital landscape will look more collaborative or more conflictual just by looking at how the platform tunes its incentives.
It's all in the math.
Let's walk through the logic of two different platform scenarios. We'll move slowly through the calculations, so the logic, not the numbers themselves, is what sticks with you. Start with a platform that values long-form, stable content like the older, monetized sections of YouTube. They prioritize viewers staying on the site.
We model this as a long-form focus. We'll set the watch time weight, beta very high, say 2.0. We'll keep the other weights moderate. Clicks, alpha at $1, shares gamma at 1.5, and the sponsor penalty, delta, at a moderate 1.0.
Okay, so if a creator chooses the collaboration strategy, the high watch time of 5 units becomes the biggest payoff driver. If we calculate the utility, we see that the bulk of the score comes from $2 times 5.5, which is the watch time, supplemented by the other metrics. The total utility comes out to about $16.55.
Now compare that to the beefing strategy. Beefing gets high clicks and shares, sure, but watch time drops to maybe 2 units, and it incurs that drama risk penalty of 3 units. When we run the calculation, the total utility for beefing drops significantly, landing at just $12 too.
$16.55 clearly beats $12 too. In this scenario, collaboration is the mathematically rational choice. This explains why creators like Mr. Beast, whose success is built on stable, high-production, high-watch-time content, thrive in this kind of environment. The algorithm, by emphasizing Patel, fosters a cooperative, or at least a non-conflictual, equilibrium.
Now, let's introduce external pressure. Sponsors get nervous. Let's say a few controversial events happen and their sensitivity increases dramatically. This is an external regulatory pressure. We can model this by raising the sponsor penalty, Del Bell to $2.55.
Collaboration's utility, that stays fixed at $16.55 because its drama risk is zero. It's inherently safe. But for the beefing strategy, the penalty nearly triples, acting as a massive disincentive.
Right. The utility for beefing plummets from $12 all the way down to $7.05.
So this is a crucial point. Sponsors act as critical external regulators. If the platform has strong relationships with advertisers who demand brand safety, the utility of drama-heavy content becomes far less profitable, even if it generates clicks.
And the platform becomes incentivized to adjust its own weights, delta die or delta da, to regulate behavior and keep those sponsors happy.
Now let's look at the opposite incentive structure, the one that really causes chaos. A platform focused purely on rapid virality and short-form engagement, like many of the nascent video platforms. Here, clicks, alpha, and shares, gamma, are king, and long-term watch time is an afterthought.
We shift the emphasis dramatically. We boost the clicks weight alpha to 2,000,000,005 and the shares weight gamma to $2. We de-emphasize watch time beta way down to 0.5, and we'll keep the sponsor penalty at a moderate 1.0.
So if we calculate collaboration, which still gets high watch time, the de-emphasis on a beta means collaboration's utility is now quite low. It lands at just $13.55.
But for beefing, the rewards just skyrocket because of the emphasis on clicks and shares. Even with the penalty, the total utility for beefing shoots up to $18.55.
$18.55 is the clear winner. In a viral short-form focus environment, beefing yields higher utility. This mathematically proves why certain platforms or segments of platforms are just perpetually toxic. The constant cycle of sensationalism, diss tracks, public feuds like the early days of the Logan Paul KSI feud. Drama becomes the rational, utility-maximizing choice despite the small penalty.
The model shows that a toxic, conflictual content environment is not a feature of human nature. It is a direct engineered function of the poorly tuned incentives set by the algorithm leader. If the algorithm prioritizes quick, explosive engagement, which is the equivalent of digital gambling, it will inherently incentivize conflict over cooperation.
But the creators themselves aren't sitting there with calculators running these numbers. They're operating under what's called bounded rationality. They don't have full access to this opaque utility function.
That's vital to recognize, yeah. Bounded rationality means human decision-making is limited by the cognitive capacity of the mind, the time available, and the information available. For content creators, the algorithm is a black box. They adapt through trial and error, through imitation, and through simple heuristics, mental shortcuts.
And the most cognitively simple shortcut to success in a high-density, low-attention environment is conflict.
Precisely. Conflict or beefing is exploited because it is a cognitively simple, highly salient, and sticky engagement strategy. It leverages deep human biases, specifically the availability and salience biases. People just disproportionately attend to conflictual, emotionally charged content. It's easier to consume and react to than complex, collaborative content.
So even if the long-term brand-building strategy of cooperation might be payoff dominant over years, the short-term, emotionally charged boost from conflict is easier to execute and provides immediate gratification. This trap leads creators into retaliatory dynamics, escalating conflict cycles, despite the potential for long-term reputational damage, simply because the heuristic for immediate attention success is clear: fight. It's a low-effort, high-reward strategy that bypasses the need for true creativity or sustained production.
We've spent considerable time establishing how optimization, whether it's for finding a partner or securing attention, pushes individuals toward high-strategy, low-vulnerability, functional interfaces. Now we need to connect this clinical detachment and risk aversion to a far broader, darker theory of social breakdown, the work of ethologist John B. Calhoun.
Calhoun's research into population density and rodent behavior, specifically his infamous Universe 25 experiment, is often cited as a potential grim preview for the future of the human race. But for listeners who might be unfamiliar, what exactly was he testing?
Calhoun's great insight was that density is not just about physical space, it's about social contact. He designed these elaborate, contained, perfect environments for Norway rats, and then for mice. Universe 25 was the most famous mouse colony. And the environment was an ideal utopian setting. Food, water, nesting material were always available in massive abundance. Disease was suppressed. The only limiting factor was space, which eventually led to inescapable social interaction.
So the population didn't collapse because they ran out of calories or clean water, which is the typical Malthusian assumption of overpopulation.
Exactly. The paradox is the abundance. The population collapse in these experiments was triggered instead by the breakdown of complex social behaviors due to the sheer pressure of mandatory, inescapable, high-density social interaction. The environment became socially toxic long before it ran out of calories. Calhoun called this phenomenon the behavioral sink.
Let's clearly define the behavioral sink as Calhoun saw it. What were the social pathologies that emerged?
It was a litany of aberrant behaviors, indicating a total failure of typical social roles. Females started abandoning or even expelling their young before weaning. Dominant males became hyper-aggressive, wounding others, while non-dominant males became totally passive and withdrawn. There was a failure to engage in necessary sexual approaches, and the established social hierarchy just dissolved into chaos and constant stressful contact. The animals, they lost their ability to form meaningful, functional social units.
That sounds like active conflict and aggression, but the story we started with, the jazz interface partner, that's a story of cold, clinical withdrawal, not aggression.
And that leads us to the most unsettling and I think relevant outcome of the experiments, the so-called beautiful ones. These were males who emerged in the later stages of the social decline, specifically after day 600 in the mouse experiments, and they had completely withdrawn from the social world. They represented a functional, albeit sterile, response to the social sink.
What characterized this asexual withdrawal, and how did they physically distinguish themselves from the others?
Their entire existence was reduced to solitary, low-risk, self-sustaining pursuits. Eating, drinking, sleeping, and crucially, intense self-grooming. They were spotless. They had sleek, healthy coats and lacked the scars that marked all the socially engaged animals. Physically, they were perfect specimens.
Peak condition.
In peak condition. But they had sacrificed their social agency. They never participated in courtship, fighting, or reproduction. Their behavior patterns were permanently changed toward total isolation and clinical self-care.
They optimized themselves for individual physical survival in isolation, but in doing so, they sacrificed all social and reproductive function. They were, as you said, physically perfect, but socially extinct.
And this pattern provides a powerful, dark analogy for the functional interface model we see emerging in human society today. We are seeing a form of self-optimization achieved by walling off our core psychological sovereignty in response to overwhelming social, informational, and economic density.
But this is a difficult analogy to make. We're talking about mice driven by instinct versus highly complex humans making rational strategic choices like viewing relationships as high-risk assets. Is it really fair to connect the two?
It's a provocative analogy, certainly not a perfect equivalence, but the behavioral outcome is strikingly similar. The pressure is the key mechanism. Calhoun's animals faced physical density. We face density in the form of information overload, competitive pressure, and the overwhelming quantity of potential partners or collaborators available digitally. This high social inflation, the cost of engagement, drives us to adopt strategic social isolation firewalls to protect the self.
So the jazz interface partner, the hyper-selective dater who perfects their digital brand and avoids long-term commitment. They're the human analogy of the beautiful one. They are maintaining a sleek, perfect, unscarred existence, avoiding the trauma of comprehensive social life by only engaging on a transactional basis.
Precisely. They have learned that the messy, comprehensive business of identity-based relationships carries too much risk, too much opportunity for time waste, emotional debt, and vulnerability. So they opt for the clinical detachment, the intense self-grooming of the digital brand, and a complete withdrawal from risky social function.
And this strategic withdrawal leads us to a significant modern anxiety we could call the algorithmic cage. If this drive toward optimization and low-risk interfacing is our response to density, what happens when we outsource the entire problem of complexity to artificial intelligence?
Well, the concern is that AI could inadvertently trigger a human behavioral sink, not through physical overcrowding, but through outsourced cognition. When we let machines handle the problem-solving, the difficult decision-making, the adaptive load, all the things that force humans to engage and struggle and adapt, we remove the necessity for complex social behavior.
If my AI interfaces handle all my difficult screening, from finding the best life partner, essentially solving the Gini coefficient problem, to scheduling my perfectly optimized day, removing all friction, then I never have to exert the mental or emotional effort of struggle.
Humans risk becoming biological spectators in a synthetic environment. We become optimized not for agency or survival in an actual complex world, but merely for machine logic. Our lives become perfectly tailored and friction-free.
The fear, then, is a soft form of extinction. Not the extinction of our physical biology, but the extinction of our agency, our adaptability, and our capacity for truly complex, risky, identity-based connection. We become the beautiful ones of the digital age, perfectly groomed and entirely catered to, yet incapable of the messy, unpredictable behavior that creates civilization.
The ultimate risk of optimization is sterility. If everything is transactional and low risk, we lose the spontaneous, non-optimized interactions that generate novel social structures and true collective value.
We've painted a picture of humanity under intense pressure, retreating into transactional interfaces and exhibiting strategic isolation. The tension we've been discussing between entrepreneurial self-interest and the need for a complex sociality, it really boils down to a fundamental conflict inherent in any social system, which we can simplify into two opposing rules.
On the one hand, we operate under the selfish action rule, Rule 1, often epitomized by Homo economicus. Always choose individual acts that give more value to oneself. This is the engine of competition, driving efficiency and competence gains.
And the opposite of that is the social action rule, Rule 2, or Homo sociologicus. Always choose social acts that give more value to the community as a whole. This is the engine of cooperation, ensuring group survival.
In social dilemmas, things like the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons, they arise precisely when these two rules contradict. If everyone follows Rule 1, the system collapses into anarchy and conflict. If everyone follows Rule 2, innovation stifles and the group may fail to adapt.
But civilization has somehow managed to reconcile these. How do massive, anonymous societies stabilize? They must rely on the growth of collective social synergy.
Social synergy is the massive surplus value created when individuals work together compared to what they could produce alone. This is the absolute key. Synergy gains increase geometrically with group size. Modern life, the quality of our food, our technology, our safety, is built on trillions of acts of synergy. The challenge is stabilizing that massive engine of value against the risk of individual defection, which is Rule 1 in excess, or stultifying conformity, which is Rule 2 in excess.
The simple utilitarian ideal, always act for the greatest good for the greatest number, is computationally infeasible. You can't calculate that over millions of people in real time. So how does human society actually stabilize synergy?
It does so through workable, anchored heuristics, psychologically efficient versions of rational logic that simplify the calculation. This is the concept of free goodness. We fix one side of the conflict, either the individual or the social, and then apply the other rule to the margin. This gives us two crucial hybrid rules, the path away from the behavioral sink.
Let's start with the one that drives our entrepreneurial section. Rule 3A, the free market rule.
Rule 3A states, choose acts that don't hurt society significantly but benefit oneself. This allows for legitimate competition. You can invent a better phone, make a profit, and drive competence gains, all while serving a social need. It limits the selfish rule with a social boundary.
And then there's the rule that stabilizes the community against total withdrawal. Rule 3B, the free service or socio-technology rule.
Rule 3B states, choose acts that don't hurt oneself significantly but benefit society. This is the key mechanism for non-coerced synergy. It describes voluntary public service, philanthropy, and the modern online phenomenon of the small hero, someone who contributes small amounts of time or energy for the collective good.
This brings us to the promise of socio-technology. Large-scale digital platforms that succeed are those that activate this inclination to be a small hero, to follow Rule 3B. We're talking about things like Wikipedia, eBay's reputation systems, or even large open-source coding communities.
These systems rely on non-coerced synergy because the design minimizes the individual cost. It doesn't hurt you significantly while maximizing the social benefit. Think about open-source contributors, for instance. They are often anonymous, freely giving highly skilled labor to a global project. The societal return on investment is massive, but the individual cost is voluntary and manageable. They are not acting for immediate financial reward, nor are they martyrs.
They are acting as free, competent citizens choosing to produce collective value because the system manifestly works and is transparent. It's neither pure capitalism, which requires constant financial rewards for every single effort, nor is it pure communism, which requires imposed order and central planning. It's a free goodness hybrid.
This reconciliation of self-interest and collective good is what allows civilization to scale exponentially. The danger of the transactional interface we discussed in the first three sections is that it only validates Rule 3A, self-benefit. And it reduces our capacity for Rule 3B because it trains us to view all non-compensated interaction as a high-risk asset or a waste of time.
That makes the final distinction between those who follow these synergistic rules and those who break them absolutely vital.
Individuals who follow Rule 1 exclusively, prioritizing personal gain at the expense of synergy-violating Rule 3A, become the criminals. They exploit the social contract, they are defectors, and they break down trust.
And those who follow Rule 2 exclusively, engaging in altruistic sacrifice for the social good and violating Rule 3B's safety net, they become the martyrs.
And interestingly, society often responds negatively to both the criminal and the martyr, seeing them as equally deviant rule breakers because they fail to follow the anchored rules of the free good citizen. The criminal is obvious, but the martyr, by sacrificing too much, introduces instability and makes others feel uncomfortable as their behavior is perceived as non-sustainable or even a rebuke of the established social agreement. Social stability demands that we find this middle way, the space of synergy, opportunity, and non-coerced service.
The functional high-strategy human interface may succeed at minimizing individual risk, but only at the massive collective cost of reducing our capacity for social synergy.
To synthesize what we've explored today, we began with that jarring shift toward clinical, transactional human interfaces, epitomized by the jazz interface and the woman who viewed deep relationships as high-risk assets. This shift is driven by the intense competition and structural uncertainty of marketized romance, where strategy replaces intimacy. We then saw how this high-strategy existence is mirrored in the attention economy, where algorithmic leaders incentivize creators to adopt conflictual or collaborative strategies based entirely on tuned metrics, potentially forcing drama over cooperation.
This pervasive drive toward rational, low-risk, entrepreneurial self-optimization echoes the profound historical warnings of social collapse, specifically John B. Calhoun's beautiful ones. Individuals who achieved a perfect, sleek isolation and self-grooming at the cost of their social agency and future function. The contemporary pressure of the digital age threatens us with a soft extinction of agency if we retreat fully into the algorithmic cage.
But the success of socio-technical systems offers a critical conceptual path forward. We recognize that human success, particularly at scale, requires not just robust defenses against antisocial defection, but the active cultivation of that free service rule 3B. Civilization and a thriving digital sphere depend on enabling non-coerced synergy, allowing the free citizen to choose to be good, simply because the transparent system rewards collective competence and value creation. The future isn't just about minimizing loss. It's about maximizing the unique value we can create together.